She only opened the drawer because it was stuck, but what she found inside would change the way she saw love forever. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and write in the comments from where are you watching this video. She hadn't planned on staying long at the house. The funeral had drained her, and the silence of her childhood home was heavier than she remembered. Dust clung to corners like memories that refused to be wiped away. The walls, once filled with laughter and warmth, now echoed with an unsettling stillness. She moved through the rooms like a guest, not a daughter, drawn not by nostalgia but by duty. Her mother's things needed sorting, and no one else seemed willing to do it. In the master bedroom, the scent of lavender lingered faintly on the curtains. Her mother had always loved that smell. It made her pause, but only for a moment. There was work to do. She opened the dresser drawers one by one, carefully, almost respectfully, sorting scarves from slips, jewelry from junk. Then came the bottom drawer, slightly off track, stubborn and swollen from years of disuse. She tugged and it gave way with a sigh. Inside, wrapped in brittle yellowing paper, was a bundle of old letters tied with a fraying green ribbon. At first she smiled. Love letters, she thought. Maybe they were from her father, written in the early days of their romance. But as she untied the ribbon and opened the first envelope, her breath caught. It wasn't addressed to her mother. The name scrawled in elegant script was unfamiliar. And the tone of the letter, it wasn't just affectionate. It was intimate, secretive, full of longing. Her eyes scanned the lines, her fingers trembling as she flipped to the signature. It was her father's name, clear, unmistakable. She sank onto the bed, the letter resting loosely in her lap. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears as she stared ahead, unseeing. The house creaked around her, uncaring, while a lifetime of certainty quietly cracked apart. This wasn't just one letter. It was a collection, spanning years. She read another, then another, and with each one the image of her father, the steady, reliable man who taught her to ride a bike, who never missed a recital, began to fade. In its place, a stranger appeared, a man capable of duplicity, a man who lived two truths at once. She tried to picture her mother reading these letters, but the thought felt cruel. Had she known? Had she silently carried the weight of this betrayal all those years? Or had she gone to her grave believing in a love that was only half real? The questions curled around her like smoke, choking her with their unanswered weight. She thought about her own marriage, her husband, their life together, the quiet dinners, the weekend rituals, the way he kissed her forehead every morning. It all felt familiar, comforting, safe. But now a whisper crept into her mind. How much of it was real? How much did she truly know? If her father had hidden an entire second life, could her husband do the same? She hated herself for thinking it, but the thought wouldn't let go. The betrayal wasn't just in the act, it was in the legacy, in the message it left behind. That even the people you love most can be strangers behind closed doors. That secrets can live in the walls of a home for decades, unnoticed and festering. That trust, once broken, even in someone else's story, can find a way to poison your own. She folded the letters gently, placing them back into the drawer. The ribbon no longer fit as neatly. Her hands moved on their own, robotic, while her mind reeled. She didn't know what to do with this knowledge. Telling her siblings felt like shattering something that had already been buried. Telling her husband felt like opening a door she wasn't ready to walk through. Instead, she stood slowly and left the room. The door clicked softly behind her. She walked through the house with quiet footsteps, as if not to wake the past. Outside, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the grass. She stepped into the fading light, her skin prickling with the chill of approaching evening. Everything looked the same, but something had changed, something deep and unseen. She realized then that this wasn't just her father's story. It was part of hers now too, and she wasn't sure where it ended. She thought she'd buried the letter in the past, until she saw her own reflection and couldn't tell where her father's story ended and hers began. It had been 2 weeks since she found the letters, and yet the weight of them followed her like a shadow. She had tucked them away out of sight, hidden in a drawer in her own home now. But the drawer might as well have been her chest, and the letters her breath, every movement tight, every thought lined with quiet ache. The discovery had loosened something in her, or perhaps it had tightened it, twisting threads of trust into knots she could no longer undo. She began noticing things she hadn't before. The way her husband would pause before answering a question, how his phone always faced down when they sat at the table, the way he smiled absently, like his thoughts were elsewhere. These were things that once meant nothing, that were dismissed as quirks of comfort or routine. But now every detail looked like a breadcrumb leading somewhere darker. She didn't want to spy. She didn't want to doubt. She hated that she even considered it. But suspicion, once invited in, never left empty-handed. It rearranged the furniture in your mind, turning the familiar into something unsteady. She began second-guessing the past. The night he came home late with no explanation, the conference trip that got extended, the vague laughter over a text he never shared. Each moment returned with sharper teeth, biting down on her peace. It wasn't just about him. It was about the echo, the strange reflection of her parents' marriage in her own. She started to wonder if all love carried this expiration, if the illusion of forever was built on secrets that everyone chose to ignore. Her father's affair wasn't a single betrayal anymore. It was a template, a legacy passed down without consent. One morning she stood in front of the bathroom mirror, watching herself. Same face, same eyes, but nothing felt the same anymore. She reached for her toothbrush and paused. Her husband's was there, beside hers, in its usual spot. It felt too symbolic. She imagined the two brushes like two people standing beside each other every day, used, rinsed, returned, close but separate, always separate. She began to ask herself questions she wasn't ready to answer. Had she ever looked closely at her husband's life outside their shared one? Had she ever asked, not out of suspicion, but out of genuine curiosity, what he needed, what he missed, what he wanted that she no longer gave? Or had they both agreed silently to pretend everything was fine because it was easier than pulling at loose threads? She remembered their early days, their stolen glances, the urgency of touch, the way time felt suspended when they were alone together. But routine is a slow eraser. It doesn't break things loudly. It sands them down, little by little, until you're left holding pieces that no longer fit. And now, with her father's secret echoing in her bones, she couldn't help but feel that erosion had already begun. Still, she loved him. That was the cruelest part. Her love wasn't gone. It was confused, tangled, afraid. It stood at the edge of something deep, unable to tell if it was a crack or an abyss. She didn't want to accuse him of something he hadn't done, but she also couldn't unknow what she knew about betrayal, about how easily someone you trust can become someone you don't recognize. One evening, they sat on the couch watching something forgettable. He reached over absently and squeezed her hand. It was meant to be affectionate, grounding, but instead it felt like a test. She studied his face, his eyes on the screen, his expression soft, relaxed. He looked like the man she married, but so had her father, and that thought cut through her like glass. The hardest part wasn't the doubt. It was the silence she kept between them, the knowledge she carried alone. She had become both the daughter haunted by her father's mistakes and the wife frightened by the possibility of her own. And she couldn't tell where one version of herself ended and the other began. She didn't want to become paranoid. She didn't want to become her mother, whether her mother had known or not. She wanted to believe there was another way, a different story, one not defined by hidden lives and quiet betrayals. But that belief felt fragile now, like something borrowed rather than owned. That night, as she lay in bed beside her husband, she stared at the ceiling and wondered if love was ever what it appeared to be, or if all of it was just beautiful fiction held together by hope and silence. She thought she was watching her life through a clear window until the glass started to fracture, and she realized it had always been a mirror. She didn't expect to find anything. That's what made it worse. There had been no plan, no intention, just a quiet curiosity born from too many silent evenings. He was in the shower, the sound of water echoing down the hallway, and his phone was on the nightstand. Normally, she would have never touched it, but the ache in her chest had grown restless, and without quite knowing why, her fingers reached for it. She didn't even know what she was looking for. Maybe reassurance, maybe nothing at all. But it was never nothing. It wasn't a name she recognized. It wasn't an overt confession. It was fragments, half phrases, hints, a softness in tone that didn't belong to a colleague or a friend. She read only a few lines before her hands began to tremble. The messages weren't recent, but they weren't old either. Just fresh enough to sting. Fresh enough to whisper the words she didn't want to say out loud. Betrayal. She placed the phone back where it had been, carefully, as though it were something sacred. The sound of the shower stopped, and she stepped back into the hallway, heart racing, face composed. By the time he came out wrapped in a towel, she was sipping tea by the kitchen window, pretending to be lost in thought. She told herself she needed time. Time to think. Time to breathe. Time to understand what she had seen and what it meant. She didn't confront him, not that night or the night after. The knowledge settled into her quietly like fog. It didn't come with rage or tears, just a slow, spreading numbness. She walked through her days like someone rehearsing the role of a wife, smiling, asking about his day, making dinner. But every action felt slightly removed, like watching herself from the outside, unsure which version of her was real anymore. And then came the dreams. Dreams of her mother sitting at the kitchen table, letters in her hands, tears on her face. Dreams of the past echoing in her present. She would wake in the middle of the night and stare at the ceiling, haunted not just by what her father had done, but by the possibility that she was now continuing the pattern. The thought carved itself into her like a scar. Was this legacy? Was this what family handed down when no one was looking? She began avoiding mirrors. Not intentionally at first, but over time, she noticed how rarely she looked herself in the eyes anymore. As if she didn't want to see the woman she had become. The one who knew too much and said too little. The one who wore the mask of patience while carrying the weight of unspoken truths. The one who loved her husband but didn't trust him anymore. The one who feared becoming her mother and yet felt herself moving closer to her with every passing day. Some mornings, she'd sit at the table with him, both of them scrolling through their phones, sipping coffee in silence. He'd glance up and smile, unaware of the storm behind her eyes. She wanted to ask him. She wanted to scream. But more than that, she wanted to believe there was a world in which she didn't have to. Instead, she began questioning everything. Every moment they shared became a riddle. Was his laughter real? Did his eyes soften because he loved her, or because he felt guilty? Had he ever stopped loving her, or had he just gotten lost in the cracks of comfort and routine? She thought back to when they met, how fiercely they had clung to each other, how every kiss felt like a promise. They used to talk for hours about everything and nothing, about dreams and fears, about the future they would build. That future was here now, and yet it felt like a copy, accurate in form, hollow in spirit. Still, she didn't hate him. That was the hardest part. She loved him enough to ache, loved him enough to want to believe it had meant nothing. But something inside her whispered that meaning didn't need intention. Even an accidental crack could shatter the frame if left long enough. And so she sat with it, with the weight of the message, with the echo of her father's secret, with the truth she couldn't unsee and the questions she didn't know how to ask. She became a woman walking two paths at once, one paved with memory and hope, the other littered with doubt and fear. Her days became a series of choices, none of them loud, none of them final. She chose silence for now, chose to watch him closely, to listen for inconsistencies, to trace patterns in his words and eyes. Not out of vengeance, but out of a need to understand if the life they built was still whole or just holding on by habit. She had always believed in love, in its resilience, in its power to heal and endure. But belief alone couldn't rewrite reality. And as much as she wanted to forgive something not yet confessed, she knew that forgiveness without truth was just another form of forgetting. One evening, as they watched an old movie on the couch, she rested her head on his shoulder and closed her eyes. He kissed her forehead, and for a moment, it felt like nothing had changed. But she knew better. The kiss was warm, but the glass had already cracked. Sometimes the things we bury don't stay buried. They find their way through cracks in memory, surfacing when we least expect, asking to be seen. The silence between them had grown into a presence, almost a third person living in their home. It breathed between words, slipped between touches, and settled in the corners of rooms where laughter used to live. She tried to pretend it wasn't there, but silence, once fed, demands acknowledgement. And when she finally did, it wasn't his voice that broke it, it was her father's. It started with a phone call. Her mother had been sorting through old boxes and found a letter. Her voice over the line was thin, distant. "I didn't know whether to tell you," she had said, "but maybe it's time." The letter wasn't addressed to her mother. It was for another woman. And it wasn't just romantic. It was full of longing, apologies, and a hope that one day things might be different. It was written while he was still alive, while they were still a family. She stared at the letter, hands cold, as her mother quietly sipped tea across the table. They didn't speak much after that. There wasn't much to say. The man she'd spent her life admiring, the one whose silence had always seemed wise, whose smile had always seemed enough, had carried another life in the shadows. Her mother didn't cry. That somehow hurt more. Pain that had long since calcified didn't need tears. It just sat quietly, like a stone at the bottom of a well. That night, back at home, she couldn't sleep. She kept staring at the ceiling, hearing her father's laugh, remembering his bedtime stories, the smell of coffee and newspaper in the morning. And overlaying it all was now a question that refused to leave. How could someone love deeply and still betray that love? It echoed so closely to what she was feeling now. The blurred messages in her husband's phone, the tenderness that remained between them, even as trust fractured. She had convinced herself that if it didn't break the foundation, maybe it could be forgotten. But now she saw her parents' quiet life for what it had been, not unbroken, but enduring despite the cracks. She found herself revisiting memories, trying to find signs she'd missed in childhood. Her father's long walks alone, her mother's sharp tone that softened as the years went on, the silences, the strength, the choices. The legacy wasn't just about what her father had done. It was about how her mother responded. She had stayed, and yet something in her had withered. The woman who once danced barefoot in the kitchen became quieter, smaller. She survived, yes, but surviving isn't the same as living. And now here she was, carrying that same weight, the same ache in her chest, the same questions swirling in her blood. Was this how the story repeated itself? Did we inherit pain like jewelry, passed from one woman's wrist to the next? She looked at her husband differently now, not just through the eyes of a wife, but through the lens of a daughter trying to make sense of her mother's silence. And she wondered, had her mother once sat in this same kind of limbo, unsure whether the comfort of familiarity outweighed the agony of truth? She didn't want to become her mother, not in this way, but she couldn't hate her either. There was a strange kind of courage in staying, in choosing peace over chaos. And yet, as she watched herself slipping into the same quiet surrender, she felt the fight leaving her bones. One afternoon, she stood in front of her wedding photo. They looked so young, so certain. The way he looked at her back then, like she was the only light in the room. She touched the glass, and her reflection stared back, eyes older, heart heavier. She wondered if the woman in the photo would recognize the one looking now. Would she be proud? Would she scream at her to run? Or would she understand? The hardest part wasn't the pain, it was the confusion. She loved him. She didn't want to leave, but she also couldn't forget. And now, armed with the knowledge of her father's hidden life, she felt like she was tracing a map etched into her DNA. One that told her forgiveness might not bring freedom, that staying might mean sacrifice, that silence once chosen might become a habit too loud to break. Sometimes she caught him looking at her like he knew something had shifted, but he didn't ask. Maybe he was afraid of the answer. Maybe he already knew. They went on like that, day after day, like two people waiting for a storm they couldn't name. And still, neither of them said the words that would shatter the calm. It wasn't cowardice. It was something more tender, the desire to protect what was left, to preserve the illusion a little longer, to see if love could still grow in a place where trust had cracked. One evening, she pulled the old letter from her father's box and held it beside the message she had read on her husband's phone. Two different hands, two different lives, but somehow the same ache bled from the page. She closed her eyes, trying to understand them both, trying to forgive them, trying to decide if forgiveness meant staying or if it simply meant letting go. What do you do when the path forward splits and both roads hold love and loss? The morning was quiet, unusually so. She sat by the window, sunlight pooling at her feet, the air still, as though the house itself was holding its breath. The weight of the past few weeks pressed heavily on her chest, and yet there was a strange kind of calm in it too, like standing on the edge of a cliff, wind in your hair, knowing you'll have to jump, but not yet, not this moment. She had lived in two worlds lately, one where she tried to pretend everything was fine, cooking dinner, folding laundry, answering questions about weekend plans, and the other, a quieter world of reflection, where thoughts spun like threads, weaving new meaning into old memories. In both, she was alone. He was still there, of course, still kind, still familiar, still saying goodnight with a kiss on the forehead, like always. But something in her no longer reached for it the same way. His presence didn't bring her back to herself. It only reminded her how far she had drifted. She thought of the woman from his messages. She didn't know her, but she imagined her anyway, what her laugh might sound like, whether she liked her coffee, black or sweet, whether she cried when he touched her the first time, or only afterward. She didn't want to know these things, and yet they visited her anyway. But more than that, she thought of her father again, of how love could stretch and bend and still break in silence. She had tried to make peace with his choices, to understand him not as a flawless figure, but as a man with needs, regrets, contradictions. Still, the shadow of that discovery hadn't left her. It had only grown, curling around her marriage like a slow vine, tightening with time. Her mother had never told anyone. The secret had lived with her until it could be passed down like an heirloom, quiet and sharp, and now it sat in her hands. She didn't want to carry it forward, to pass it to the next generation in the same hushed way. But how could she break a cycle without shattering herself in the process? She had begun to write again. Letters she never sent, thoughts she never said aloud. In one she had written, "I still love you, but I'm not sure that's enough. And I don't know what scares me more, losing you or losing myself beside you." She had folded it into her journal, unsure whether it was meant for him, for her father, or just for the version of herself she once was. The people around her had started to notice something. Friends asked gently if she was okay. Her sister called more often, as if intuitively sensing a shift. But she didn't have words yet. It wasn't sadness exactly. It wasn't anger. It was a stillness so loud it kept her awake at night. She'd gone for long walks, hoping clarity would meet her in the rhythm of footsteps and the quiet whisper of trees. Sometimes it helped. Most times, it only deepened the questions. Was it weak to stay? Was it selfish to leave? Would she become her mother if she stayed? Or would she become someone else entirely if she walked away? She tried to remember what it felt like to be in love with him before any of this. The excitement, the laughter, the silly inside jokes that made no sense to anyone else. They still had moments like that sometimes. Fleeting, fragile moments that tricked her heart into hope. But hope can be cruel when it asks you to wait for something that may never return. One night they lay side by side in bed, not touching, not speaking. The space between them was only inches, but it might as well have been miles. She wanted to roll over, to ask him, "Do you still love me the same way?" But she didn't, and he didn't ask either. What remained between them wasn't absence. It was the echo of a presence that used to feel whole. And in that silence, she knew. Love wasn't always loud. Sometimes it left quietly, respectfully, like a guest slipping out the door at the end of a long night. And still, she hadn't chosen. She hadn't packed a bag. She hadn't made a final decision. Every day she stood in that uncertain space, trying to measure love against betrayal, memory against future. Each option held its own kind of grief, each one a version of herself she wasn't sure she could become. Was she waiting for him to fight for her? Or waiting for herself to find the strength to leave? Maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe she just needed time to accept that no choice would feel clean or easy, only necessary. As the days stretched on, she grew quieter, but not weaker. There was power in holding the question, in not rushing the answer. There was grace in pausing at the edge, learning the shape of the wind before the leap. She didn't know what would come next, only that something would. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next video. Feel free to share this video with others and check out more stories on our channel.